Well, welcome everybody to this 1 hour presentation. At least I hope it's just going to be 1 hour. It depends how many questions get asked during the session. So I'm going to be romping through a history of Olympic rowing. Now, if you're an aficionado of pub quizzes, you'll know that there have been 28 Olympic Games to date. And I'm going to be drilling down to the individual regattas, the venues of those regattas, and picking out a few key stories that I hope are going to inform and entertain you. So let's start at the very beginning. And it all started with this chap. Now, if you look at him, he could be any old guy sculling along in a pretty broad-beamed clinker sculling boat. But this is, in fact, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, who was a multiple sportsman. He was very interested in rowing amongst his many accomplishments. But he had a private income, and that allowed him to indulge his passion for a whole variety of sports. And he was also a fan of Henley Royal Regatta. And if you've been to Henley, you'll know that people dress up in their finery to go into the steward's enclosure. And this is what Henley looked like in the latter part of the 19th century when de Coubertin went along. And what he liked about it was as much the finery, but also the way in which Henley Royal Regatta was governed by, in those days, a group of accomplished men who all knew about the sport. And amongst their number, they elected a committee of management, and then the committee elected their chairman. And that is the model that he used when he first designed the International Olympic Committee. And here is the first IOC, a group of men from a variety of sports and backgrounds who governed the first Olympic Games in the 1890s. I particularly like that guy on the right. I think he's some sort of Prussian army officer, but you can imagine the sword going down well at committee meetings. But amongst their number, there were two British guys, so Great Britain already well represented in those early days. And they formulated the first Olympic Games. De Coubertin didn't take part in the initial discussions, but he was president of the International Olympic Committee by the time the first games were held in Greece. And Greece was chosen because that was where the ancient Olympics were held some 2,000 years ago, but they had great pagan connotations in those times. And with the Roman influence, the Romans trying to introduce Christianity to the so-called civilized world. And that was when the ancient Olympics disappeared, only to be reincarnated in the modern Olympics. And the first were held in 1896 in Athens, which you can see there at the top of the picture. And the nearest point on the coast is the port of Piraeus. And that's where the first Olympic regatta was due to be held, on the sea across that bay that you can see just to the right of the name badge for Piraeus. And here is the page from the Olympic program from those days. And you can see that it's in Greek and French. Greek because that was the local language, obviously, in Athens, and French because that was the international language of sport at the time. Now, if you were entry secretary for the Olympic Regatta in 1896, you'd probably have been disappointed because there were only 4 events on the card. Well, that's a good start, but there were 1 entry each for 2 of those events and 2 entries each for the other 2 events. So this was not going to be a mega spectacle. And in fact, it wasn't any spectacle at all, because on the afternoon that they'd scheduled to hold the Olympic Regatta, the sea was so rough that they simply called it a day and called the regatta off. So at the very first Olympics in 1896, there was no rowing. So we now have to turn our attention fast forward 4 years to 1900, and this is the Paris Games, the first of the Paris Games. And I know many of you will have been to Paris. You'll know that the city centre is in the centre of this shot, and you've got the River Seine snaking its way around up to the northwest, to the sea, to the English Channel. And that red line across one stretch of the river marks the Olympic course of 1900. Now, interestingly, the British interest rested on this one man, and he went by the exotic name of St. George Ashe. You've probably never heard of him because those are Thames Rowing Club colours that he's competing in. And Thames and Mr. St. George Ashe had an ongoing battle because the Thames Committee decided from time to time they didn't actually want him representing their club in any particular regatta because he was found guilty of unsportsmanlike conduct on a pretty regular basis. So sometimes Thames let him row under their colours, and sometimes he just did his own thing. And he blew hot and cold on the water as well, sometimes winning and sometimes not being terribly successful. And in fact, he took himself off to the Olympics in 1900. He wasn't nominated by the British authorities. And lo and behold, he went and won the bronze medal. But having come home, once again, he fell out with the Thames Committee and they went their separate ways. Now, I know some of you will be familiar with a website called heartheboatsing.com. It's a rowing history website. And my friend Tim Cock has written one particular blog recently about this chap. And it's quite a sad story, actually, because in retrospect, he had what at best can be termed a personality disorder, and at worst an actual psychiatric illness which appeared to run in the family. And he came to an early end, and because of one thing and another, he is not remembered by any part of the rowing establishment, despite the fact that he was GB's first Olympic medalist in rowing. So let's fast forward another 4 years, and we are in St. Louis, the first time that the United States has hosted the Games. Now, if you look at this picture of the running track carefully, you'll notice an interesting facet, and that is that they are running clockwise around this track. And they did this for a few years, and then the rules changed. And if you look at any international running track now, they run in an anti-clockwise direction. And there are various reasons why this has happened. I'm not sure any of them is ground in truth, but that need not concern us. We're all about the rowing here. Now in the St. Louis Games, about 95% of the participants came from the United States. Great Britain didn't take part, and if you look at the stats for the Olympic regatta, in fact, all three of the medals in every event were won by the Americans. The only one where they didn't win the medal was the silver medal in the men's eights, and that was won by Canada because there were only 2 entries in the men's eights. There would have been more European entries at these games because the Americans promised to send boats across to fetch to ferry the competitors across, but for whatever reason, they didn't transpire. So it was a disappointing event and sort of written off by the Europeans. So let's move forward another 4 years. And now for the first time, the games are being held in Great Britain, and the Olympic regatta is being held at Henley. To remind you that de Coubertin was a great fan of Henley, and so it's no surprise that the first time that Great Britain hosted the Games, the Olympic regatta was held over what was then the most famous regatta course in the world. But don't forget, it's only 2 lanes wide compared with the modern standard of 6 lanes. It wasn't quite the full 2,000 meters, or what has become the 2,000 meters standard distance. And of course, because it's on a river, it's moving water, it's not still water. And it was to be another 50 plus years before all these things were standardized. But this was Great Britain's awakening in Olympic rowing. There were 4 events on the card, and Great Britain won gold in all 4 of them, and silver in 2 more. And here is the final of the men's eights. And you can see that on the scoreboard, on the finish post, just to the bottom right of the picture, you can see that this is Leander beating Belgium for the gold medal. Now, this is one of the great incongruities at the time, because you think, hang on a minute, Leander's the name of a club, Belgium is the name of a country, how does this work? Well, this was because in those days, a nation was allowed to enter more than one crew per event, and GB entered 2 crews for the men's 8s, and the other crew was Cambridge University, and they won the bronze medal. But as I say, Great Britain, very successful, and here are a whole bunch of the guys that won gold medals in the men's 8s, the men's 4s. The events had not yet been standardized in the Olympics. There was a lot of toing and froing. Sometimes it was the double scull, sometimes the coxless pair, sometimes the coxed pair, sometimes perming any 2 of them, as well as sometimes the coxless rather than the coxed 4. So different games had different priorities, as we'll see. Just to concentrate on a few of these athletes, in the center of the picture, wearing the cap, a guy called Don Burnell, who rowed at 5 in the gold medal 8. And 40 years later, his son won the gold medal in the double sculls, and we're going to be seeing him a little later on. And then to his right, the chap with the fair hair and his arms folded, that's Frederick Kelly, who was a very accomplished musician as well as being a member of the gold medal 8. And he retired after these Olympics because he wanted to concentrate on his musicianship. He was worried that too much rowing would actually reduce the sensitivity in his fingers when he played the violin and the piano. And sadly, he died during the First World War, which was to take place just 6 years after the Olympic Games. And that was the fate that befell the majority of the men in this picture. This picture was taken just after the Olympics on the steps at Leander. And if you tried to recreate this picture some 10 years later, then less than half of these men would still be alive. That was one of the great sadnesses of the nation at that time. So during the war, of course, no Olympics. So we have to fast forward. Sorry, we're jumping the gun again, aren't we? So 4 years later, 1912, and the games are held in Stockholm. And this is obviously a modern picture of the city. Some of you might have been to Sweden, might have visited its capital, and you'll know that Stockholm, although in theory it's staged on the sea, it is actually many miles from open water. It's in the middle of a whole series of narrow waterways and islands. And the Djurgårdsbrunnsviken is this inlet that you can see just in the foreground here. And it's a narrow, sheltered piece of water. And in the distance, where that wake is from a boat that's come up fast around that corner, that ends up in the city center. And this is the Olympic regatta course from 1912. So let's take a closer look at it. And here's a contemporary map of the time. And this is looking at it, obviously, from overhead. So the start is to the right, the finish is to the left. And you can see there's actually a bit of a dog's leg in the course. It goes under a railway bridge towards the finish, and then the finish line finishes up along one of the big boulevards that lines the quay in the city centre, and that allowed the authorities to put up grandstands. So that allowed them the crowds to view the finish. Now, again, one of the vagaries of the Olympics at that time, I was talking a little earlier about the way in which different regattas held different events. So Stockholm was one of the few regattas to allow a category for inboard coxed fours, which is what you can see here. And in fact, the Stockholm Games was the only Olympics to have this particular category. We all know that outrigged boats go much faster. But no doubt there were a few local clubs that supported this event, but I put that in just for interest's sake, because from a GB point of view, we retained the gold medal in the men's 8s, and here is the GB crew from that time. Looking rather disconsolate. I don't know when this picture was taken. Surely it can't have been taken after they won the gold medal. I particularly like that gnarled old bloke on the right with wearing the boater. He's the boatman, obviously. There's some sort of academic chap over on the left there. Now, one of the interesting things about this cruise win is that once they'd won the gold medal, they could not afford to bring their boat home again. The boat stayed in Stockholm. And so about 10 years ago, I was in Sweden on business, and a friend of mine who's the chief executive of the River and Rowing Museum at that time said, could I possibly go and find the boat, which was still believed to be somewhere in the city, and could I arrange to borrow it because the museum would like to mount a display incorporating that boat at the 2012 Olympics, which were then 2 or 3 years away. And I thought, well, there's a task on my hand because I've already got my business itinerary laid out for my 1 week visit. But a little bit of homework allowed me to establish the fact that it was not, as my friend suggested, hanging from the ceiling of some restaurant downtown, which would have been a pretty challenging task to go and find the thing. It was in fact in the main reception lobby of the new Museum of Sport in Stockholm, and here it is. And I rang the museum once I'd established where it was, and even though the museum was closed on the day that I had available to visit, they let me in, and I had my own private tour, courtesy of the curator. And here is the hull. The riggers have long since rotted away, and the hull was in really good nick. And the museum agreed to lend it to us if we arranged for insurance purposes, and we'd arranged to carry it as deck cargo across the North Sea to bring it to the UK. But unfortunately, the final hurdle, our plans fell apart because the Olympic authorities at Dorney would not allow the museum to have even a charitable private exhibit, because as you know, the Olympics guards its own intellectual property. So nobody that is not an official partner of the Olympics is allowed to have a presence at an Olympic venue. So the boat is still there. So next time you're in Stockholm, do take the chance to go and see it. Now, a couple of other things that I saw while I was over there, the curator was keen to show me. Here is the medal ceremony for the track and field events in Stockholm. Now, we're all familiar, aren't we, with the medalists standing on the podium, and then the VIP comes and places the medal around their neck. The reverse was true in 1912. Here is the King of Sweden with his hot top hat standing on the podium, and the medalists came and paraded along in front of him. And then they all had a laurel wreath done ceremoniously on their head by the king. So here's this woman athlete wearing her laurel wreath and shaking his hand. And then she will go off to one side and she will be given the medal and a separate non-ceremony without a ribbon. So there's no hanging of the ribbon around her neck. There's no grand hurrah. Obviously, television hadn't been invented at this stage, so a completely different kettle of fish from the ceremony as we understand it in 100 years later. Okay, now we do fast forward. The Great War intervenes, so we're now back at the 1920 Games in Antwerp. Again, no suitable water in Antwerp itself, so the Olympics was held on what is called the Willebroek Canal, which is between Brussels and Antwerp. And here is the single sculls that was staged there. If any of you are familiar with the Belgian international rowing course at Hazewinkel, that's just up the road from this canal. And the Olympic single sculls were won for the USA by Jack Kelly, who was an artisan. He was a professional builder, and therefore he was not allowed to enter Henley. It was his son, Jack Kelly, who entered that regatta some 25 years later. to great success in the diamond sculls. Another 4 years and we're back in Paris. And this is a Monet representation of the Bassin d'Argenteuil, which is another stretch of the River Seine. Obviously a pretty scenic stretch to attract Monet's attention, but I suspect that it didn't really look like this during the Olympic Games. So just to give you another flavor of where it is, you'll remember that map of Paris that I showed you earlier with that horizontal red line at the bottom. You can see that we've moved downstream a bit around the corner for these games. And so the red line at the top represents exactly where the Olympic regatta was on this occasion. Now, this was the Chariots of Fire Games. So if you've seen the feature film, that's some 35 years old now, dwelling on Harold Abrahams, who won the gold medal in the 100 meters, and the other Brits who medaled in the hurdling events. That was all going on in the Olympic Stadium. And meanwhile, I'm just going to drill down on one particular success, and that was the men's eights. And the USA won it on that occasion. Benjamin Spock rode in the 7th seat of this crew, and he went on to become a world famous pediatrician. At this time, Great Britain and the USA were very, very strong rowing nations, and that was the way they shared top honors throughout these early years, particularly in the single sculls, particularly in the men's eights. But I explained how GB topped the men's eights in 08 and 1912, but it was going to be almost another 100 years before they got the gold in the men's eights. That didn't happen again until Sydney. But this success was not to last, but we'll come to that in a minute. So let's move forward another 4 years to the Amsterdam Games of 1928. Now, again, some of you will be familiar with the current international rowing course in Amsterdam, which is the Bosbaan, which is that horizontal blue bar at the bottom of your picture next to the Bosbaansweg, the road that runs alongside it. But the Bosbaan had not been channeled out to form an international rowing course 100 years ago. But obviously the city is riddled with canals of one sort and another, and the authorities decided that the canal at Sloten, which is up on the left there, halfway up your picture, that was laid out as the straight 2-lane course for the Olympic Games. And our attention switches on this occasion to the men's single sculls, where Bobby Pearce became the first Australian Olympic champion in men's singles, and GB won the bronze medal. And here is David Collett, who won the bronze medal on that occasion. Now, in the same way that I mentioned St. George Ashe as a name you probably haven't heard of since, so the name of David Collett is another name that just disappeared from view for entirely different reasons to Mr. Ashe. So Collett was an ultimate sportsman. He won Henley several times. He helped Cambridge win the boat race 3 times. And his final triumph was in the Olympic single sculls in 1928. Now, normally, then as now, you would expect an Olympic medalist to have been given an MBE or something, or be president of his rowing club, or be a Henley steward or something like that. But no, Mr. Collett disappeared from view entirely. Now, many of you know that wearing another hat, I work as a professional genealogist, and I managed to track down what happened to Mr. Collett. And it turns out that he suffered from asthma, exercise-induced asthma, which was quite a problem in those days because the medicines, things like Ventolin and such, had not been invented. And yet, despite all that, he won an Olympic medal. And then his doctors advised him that for the good of his long-term health, he would be better off moving to a climate that was warmer and drier. So he moved to the USA, and he ended up as building up a real estate portfolio in Arizona, where he became a training partner of Jesse Owens, who triumphed at the 1936 games in the 100 meters. And Collett married, and he had children, and I managed to track down 3 of his surviving children on the west coast of America. And then a few years ago, we, in combination with that, we also tracked down Collett's nephews and nieces, the other side of his family in the UK. And we introduced the 2 sides of his family live on air on Radio Berkshire. So it was one of the highlights of, which games did we link it to? But a few years ago. So that was quite a success story. And I don't think they've met in real life yet. They're waiting for restrictions to end before they'll allow that sort of thing. Okay, 1932, we're now in Los Angeles for the first time, Long Beach, California. This is an aerial view of what Long Beach looks like now. You can see that it's full of fancy villas and boat marinas, etc. But this is what it looked like in those far off days. And those are oil derricks in the background. Long Beach, oil had been discovered there some 10 or 15 years previously, and everybody was keen to grab a piece of the action. So there were oil derricks left, right, and center, scarring the landscape. They still drill for oil at Long Beach, but in a much more subtle way, because there's still quite a considerable reserve of oil under the surface of the land. But one of the fancy things they did all those years ago was to get all the athletes competing at the Olympic regatta to pose together in one big picture. I mean, this is a nightmare as far as any photographer is concerned, trying to get this number of people to sit up straight and have their photograph taken. There are more than 500 athletes in the Olympic regatta these days. And the idea of getting them all together in one place like this, I can tell you now, it just wouldn't happen. Okay, 4 years later, and we are now in Berlin, an infamous games for so many reasons. 3 years previously, Hitler had been declared Chancellor of Germany and had brought his own political ideology to the nation, and he was determined that the games would mirror his particular beliefs. And the Olympic regatta was held here on the Langersee, just a few kilometers outside Berlin city centre. It's still a hotbed of rowing activity to this day. Now, because Hitler's department was so keen that his nation would do well, it is true, they virtually swept the board in the medals, certainly at the Olympic regatta, with 2 notable exceptions. And one of them was in the men's double sculls, where Great Britain won gold, with Southwood and Beresford. Southwood on the left, Beresford on the right. And there on the stern of their boat is the wreath that they were awarded as part of the medal ceremony. So they had to scull away with this, with this wreath acting as dead weight on the stern of the boat. Next time you're in Henley and you're able to nip into the River and Row Museum, because that wreath is actually part of one of the exhibits in the rowing gallery. And the other big notable exception, much to Hitler's chagrin, was when the USA won gold in the men's eights. And this is the University of Washington eight, who against all the odds came and won gold. After a fairly rocky training, it was not expected that they would do so well, because their training progress, their disadvantaged background, plus the fact that they were up against the German political machine, were all odds that stood against them. But their story was told in wonderful fashion in a book that you may have written, have read. If you haven't read it, do grab the chance when you can, because this, yes, it's a book about rowing, but also it's a book about so much else. because it's a book about the Olympics, and it's also a sociological book about the disadvantaged background. None of the men who rowed in this crew are still alive, but Daniel James Brown, who wrote the book, interviewed a number of the participants before they died, and he was able to bring their stories to bear in a very real way. It's a great book, and it's going to be turned into a feature film before long, I'm sure. Okay, the Second World War intervened, and now for the 1948 Games, we are back in Henley. Now, Great Britain was supposed to host the Games in 1944, but of course they were cancelled. And so these games were run on an absolute shoestring. The budget for these games was £70,000, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it wasn't even a lot then. It's the equivalent of £1.75 million in today's money. Now, if I tell you that the current budget for the Tokyo Olympics is 15 billion, then you can get a measure for the shoestring upon which these games were held. This is the Olympic medal ceremony for the men's double sculls, and behind the lady in the fancy hat is Dick Burnell, the son of Don Burnell, who won gold in the 08 Games in the men's eights that I told you about previously, and his sculling partner, Bert Bushnell, the shorter chap with the glasses to his left. And these two guys were so different in physique. There was about 4 or 5 stone between them. There was about 6 inches in height between them. And they also came from different social backgrounds. So Burnell, Eton and Oxford, private income, Bushnell from a family of boat builders, and yet despite their differences, they came together in a boat to make it go very fast indeed. And their story was told in a feature film that was put together some 10 years ago called Bert and Dickie, that you may have seen. It was one of a couple of medals that were won for Great Britain in those games. The other one being in coxless pairs. There are the 2 gold medal crews down in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. This is a list of all the GB oarsmen, men only, still a long time to go until women were admitted to the games. So there's Bushnell and Burnell in the double. In the coxless pair, Ran Laurie and Jack Wilson. And Ran Laurie was the father of Hugh Laurie, the actor. Hugh Laurie, who some 30 odd years later was to row in the boat race for Cambridge. He was also a GB junior in the men's pairs. And then of course he gave up rowing to concentrate on his acting. There's a picture, nice happy picture, all the GB rowing squad all blazered up. Now, I was telling you about the way in which these games were run on a shoestring, and another book was written about 10 years ago, and it was called The Austerity Olympics. It was written by Janie Hampton, who's an Oxford-based author, and it's a cracking read. Obviously, it doesn't just cover the rowing, it covers the whole gamut of the games and how they were put together on such a low budget. It was very successful organisationally, but it wasn't very successful as far as GB is concerned. So Great Britain won gold in 2 of the rowing events and in 1 sailing event, and those were the only gold medals won by Great Britain at those games. So they put on a fantastic games against all the odds, but were not very successful in terms of the actual performance. 4 years later, and we're now in Helsinki. And the rowing events were held on that little water course just in the top of the picture at Melati. And you can see that this is rowed on seawater. This was the last occasion currently that rowing events were held on seawater. And we'll come to that later. Not a particularly successful games from a Great Britain point of view. Here is the men's 8. And you can see that here they are training at Henley before they left for Finland. That's Henley Bridge in the background. And the men's 8 finished 4th, and in fact 4th was the best position achieved by any GB crew at those games. Because this was the point at which the success that I was talking about for Great Britain, for the United States, for Australia, began to fall off significantly, because this was the point at which the Cold War drifted onto the sports arena, because the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, East Germany, and the other nations in the Eastern Bloc were suddenly using sport as an arena in which to fight their political ideologies. And we'll see those nations beginning to climb the medal table and achieve dominance right through the 50s and 60s. 1956, the Melbourne Games, they were held on Lake Wenduri in the town of Ballarat, which was some 80 miles to the northwest of Melbourne. One of the truisms about rowing, because of, as we all realize, it needs a 2,000 meter international straight course, that's not always found as close to the center of the Olympic city as might be deemed appropriate. Therefore, it's quite often the case that the rowing venue is really quite some way from the Olympic Stadium, and it certainly was in Melbourne. I'm going to talk about these two individuals, because this is Vyacheslav Ivanov, the Soviet sculler who won the gold medal on the left, and Sam Mackenzie, who was representing Australia on the right. And Mackenzie won the silver medal. And these two met each other time and time again throughout international competition. And when they met at the Olympics, Ivanov always beat Mackenzie. When they met at Henley, which they did many times, Mackenzie always beat Ivanov. And Mackenzie went down in history as the only man to win 6 straight Diamonds Challenge Trophy successes at Henley. From 1957, for 6 years on the trot, he won the Diamonds. Only one man has ever achieved, has matched that, and that was when Mahe Drysdale won his 6th Diamonds a couple of years ago. But Mahe did it in dribs and drabs, and Mackenzie just went and did it in 6 straight wins. Mackenzie died during the first lockdown. He died last year. He'd spent the last 30 years of his life in the UK. He lived in Wellington, in Somerset. And they still haven't had a celebration of his life because of the restrictions. And because Henley was so close to his heart, it is likely that when things get a little easier, the service of thanksgiving for his life will be in Henley, and his ashes will be scattered on or near the river because of his so many successes on the regatta course. Now, 4 years later, we're in Rome, and this is Lake Albano, just outside the city. Now, these games were important in rowing terms for more reasons other than the pure rowing activity. The most successful crew from GB point of view was the men's 8. It was the Oxford University 8 who'd won the boat race that year, but they weren't terribly successful at the Olympics. They certainly didn't win a medal, but at least they managed to reach the final. But Lake Albano was achieved fame for other important reasons. So for the first time, the Olympic rowing course was the full 2,000 meters, and it was still water, and it was 6 lanes wide. And that's the way it has stayed ever since. So this was the first time that the international diktat of an Olympic venue was agreed. And it was also the point at which the buoying system was agreed. And that's why the standard buoying system for a multi-lane regatta course is called the Albano system. This picture is actually Plovdiv in Bulgaria, which has been the scene of so many world championships in recent years. And you can see the boys there in their straight lines. In the early days, with natural rowing courses, deep courses, uneven surfaces to the, uneven bottoms to the lake, and it meant that you couldn't easily just lay a cable along the foot of the lake and attach the ropes to each of these buoy lines. So what the Albano system does is to suspend the longitudinal cable about 3 meters under the surface of the water, and the weight of the cable is held in place by the buoys themselves, which are tethered by 3-meter vertical cables between the buoy and the longitudinal line. And then there's a big windlass at either end of the longitudinal cables to haul the cables into straight lines. And this is the system that is put in place as part of the infrastructure at every international course since. 4 years later, and we are in Tokyo for the first time, and the rowing course is held on the River Toda to the north of the city centre. Now, I was talking about Great Britain's fading success following the 1948 Games. Tokyo represented one bright blip on the horizon because this was Great Britain's only medal for many years, and it was won in the Coxless Fours when GB won silver. And I was desperately looking for a photograph of that silver medal four. Sorry, this is the Toda course. Obviously, this is a modern picture showing a training boat. That's not a racing boat, a coxed four on the river course. I was looking for a picture of the silver medal four for Great Britain, and I couldn't find a contemporary picture. All I could find was a picture of Bill Barry here in his latter coaching days, who rowed in that crew. The crew came out of Tideway Scullers Rowing Club, now based at Chiswick, and Bill went on to a very successful coaching career. So he coached Alan Campbell in the single scull right up to Alan's bronze medal at the London Olympics in 2012. We are now in Mexico City, 1968. Mexico City is at altitude, and so is Lake Xochimilco, a few miles outside Mexico City. And this really was the low point as far as established rowing nations like Great Britain and the United States were concerned, because for the first time in Olympic rowing history, neither country featured in the top 3 on the medal table. And this was where East Germany finally achieved dominance, and DDR was top of the medal table. Great Britain at this point was at a pretty low ebb. They decided they wouldn't send a mega rowing team to Mexico City because Great Britain wasn't proving particularly successful. And because it was a long way to go, it was very expensive. So Great Britain only sent a men's 8 and a single scull. They both reached the final, but neither crew medaled. But because they only sent 2 crews, there were massive political battles back home. There were several crews, particularly the Nottingham-based 4, that thought they'd won the right to win a place at the Olympics, but the authorities were against that idea. And there were several now big names in rowing who lost their chance to go to those Olympics because of that decision. 1972, and it's the Munich Games. And the purpose-built regatta course at Oberschleißheim, just outside the M25 of Munich, if you can call it that. The Oberschleißheim course has been the venue for a great many World Championships and World Cup regattas since that time. It's sort of fallen in a bit into disrepair. It's had no major reconstruction work since 1972. And here is this enormous grandstand. It holds 10,000 people, and it's built out of solid concrete. And one thing that the authorities didn't understand at the time, they do now, is the way in which this grandstand created enormous wind shadow over the last 250 meters of this course. So that if you drew one of the lanes on the inside nearest the grandstand, You were rowing in a comparative vacuum. You weren't exposed to the same sort of wind speeds that the crews on the other side of the lake were concerned. And there were several crews that felt they were denied the chances of a medal because of those unfair conditions. As I said, there has been a lack of investment in this venue over recent years, despite the fact this place hosted the World Championships in 2007. The City Council withdrew their funding for many years, but it's back on the map because this venue is going to be hosting the Europeans next year. And there was supposed to be an injection of funds to bring it back up to speed, ready for that regatta. But again, because of COVID, it was announced last week, because budgets are tight, they're being diverted in other more important areas, that funding for this venue has drastically been reduced. So we're going to have to wait and see how next year's Europeans stack up. We are now in Montreal in '76, and the Olympic Regatta is held on the Notre Dame Island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. This is an amazingly canny way of staging an Olympic venue that is right at the heart of the host city. Look, here is the host city, the majority of downtown on the left there, and there is the St. Lawrence River running top and bottom with the island in the middle, the Notre Dame Island, and there on the right of your picture is the rowing course that has been built within that island. So it can be topped up with fresh water at top and bottom to allow it to be flushed through so you don't get an accumulation of blue-green algae and other pests like that. And it also means that you're making use of the natural resources and, as I say, centering the activity on as close as you can to the Olympic Stadium and the Olympic Village. Now, from a GB point of view, this marked the beginning of the resurgence of Great Britain back onto the international stage. The authorities had taken a leaf out of the Eastern Bloc book. What had happened hitherto was that Great Britain were relying on the individual club crews to represent Great Britain at individual Olympics, so that Club A would have the fastest 8, Club B would have the fastest 4, Club C would have the fastest sculler, and that was the way in which the Olympic squad was put together. But that's not the way the Eastern Bloc did it. The Eastern Bloc said, right, we'll put all our athletes in one pool, doesn't matter which club they come from, right, you 9 guys, you're the 8, you 4 guys, you're the Coxless 4, and so on and so forth. So they all trained together as a squad, they all trialed as a squad, and then the selectors made their choice. And GB had brought a guy called Bob Janeček over from the Czech Republic, where he'd won an Olympic bronze medal with the Czech 8. They brought him over, and the Montreal Games was the first reflection of the success that he brought to the squad, because GB won the silver medal on that occasion. And here are the guys. Well, in fact, it's not this particular 9 guys, because this picture was taken at Henley the previous year, where they won the Grand Challenge Cup. And there is Bob on the right-hand side of the picture. And here are the 9 guys. Pat Sweeney, the Cox in front there. Tim Crooks in the pale vest to the right of Pat Sweeney. Tim is an honorary member of Castle Dore because he came and spoke at the Castle Dore dinner when I was captain about 35 years ago. Hugh Matheson, a name that might be familiar to some of you, won the Diamonds. He's was the independent rowing correspondent. He's the guy second from the left there. Number of big rowing names there. And as I say, they won the silver medal in men's 8s at Montreal. So let's forward to the Moscow Games, 1980. Now, this was a notorious Games for other reasons, because it was the first boycotted Games, boycotted by the USA and other Western nations to protest against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So because of that, the results were skewed a little, and there were some unexpected results. across many Olympic disciplines, including the rowing, which was staged at the nattily named Trade Unions Olympic Sports Centre. But the one crew that I'm going to concentrate on is the men's 8, because this man, Colin Moynihan, he'd coaxed Oxford to victory in the boat race some 3 years previously, and he was later to become Minister of Sport in the Conservative government. But his fame came in the Olympic regatta when he steered the GB men's 8 to a silver medal. And the story of this event is the way in which during the Olympic final, his rudder wires broke. And he realized that there was a problem, so he solved it by reaching round behind him and grabbing hold of the T-bar on top of the rudder pin and steering his crew with his hands behind them to enable his crew to gain the advantage. They didn't quite win gold, but the silver medal here marked the continuing resurgence of GB back onto the Olympic rowing stage. Now, 4 years later, and we are in Los Angeles once again, and the Olympic rowing events held far, far north of Los Angeles on Lake Casitas. And this marks the beginning of Steve Redgrave's Olympic rowing career. And here he is lying back on the finish in this somewhat grainy picture after the gold medal has been won in the men's coxed fours. It's grainy not only because it's an image I pinched from somewhere, but also because there was a mist hanging on the water. All the rowing events were held very early in the morning for a variety of weather conditions at the time. But here he is lying back, having been successful. And of course, this was the start of his 5 gold Olympic career, along with Andy Holmes just behind him, Richard Budgett, who's now the Chief Medical Officer for the International Olympic Association, and Martin Cross, my commentary colleague in the bow there, with Adrian Ellison lying down in the bow in this front loader. 4 years later, and we are now at the Seoul Games, the Han River Regatta course, and I'm simply going to concentrate once again on Redgrave, this time in the pair, his second Olympic medal. Well, second and third, because of course, as well as winning the gold in the Cox-less pair with Andy Holmes here, he also won the bronze medal in the coxed pair. He and Holmes with the Cox Pat Sweeney came third in the coxed pair. So next time you're in a pub quiz and you get asked how many Olympic medals has Redgrave won, the answer is not 5, which is the usual answer that people give, it's 6, because he won 5 golds plus the bronze in the Cox pair at Seoul. 92, the Barcelona Games, and the Olympic regatta was held on the lake at Banyoles, which is a little village just outside the town of Girona, again many miles to the northeast of Barcelona. Banyoles is a really nice lake. It's a very popular training venue. Maybe Castle Dore will get out there for a winter training camp one day. Something to look forward to, because a lot of GB clubs go out there. Cambridge University go out there. A number of other domestic clubs visit regularly. It's fine in the morning, but it's very windy in the afternoon. Just a word of warning. But 92, of course, Redgrave and Pinsent this time won the gold in the Cox-less pair. But I'm going to concentrate on these 3 guys, because this is the Searle brothers together with Gary Herbert, their Cox. And these were the last men to win gold in the coxed pair. This was the last time that the coxed pair was part of the Olympic program. Do you remember I was talking about the way in which the events that were included in the Olympics chopped and changed through many years, but it had now been standardized for some years. But then this was the point, the last time the coxed 4 and the coxed pair were raced was at Barcelona, and then these events were dropped to allow lightweights to be admitted from the 96 games onwards. So Johnny on the right, Greg on the left, and Gary Herbert, who's now a BBC commentator for rowing, and they came storming past the Abernally brothers in the closing stages of that games quite unexpectedly. They were very young guys. Greg was only 19, Johnny was only 22, and it really was a stunningly surprising performance by those guys. 96 games, this is Lake Lanier outside Atlanta. This was the first time that, as I say, that women were admitted to the Olympic rowing events. But again, there were only 6 events on the card for women as opposed to 8 for men. So we certainly hadn't got gender equity at this stage. But lightweights were admitted. And the reason why they were admitted was to try and adopt the Olympic ideal of so-called universality, which is one of the watchwords in the Olympic ideal, to allow participation by as many men and women from as many different countries as possible. And the reason why lightweights were admitted to rowing was to try and allow countries to take part where the ethnic makeup of those countries did not allow men of 90 kilos who were nearly 2 meters tall. They just didn't exist. So by adopting lightweights was the idea that more nations could take part. In fact, that idea didn't work, as we'll see later on. And that was why lightweights are now being dropped from the Olympic program. All that happened, in fact, in retrospect, was that those nations which were already successful at open weight rowing added a lightweight string to their bow. It didn't allow greater numbers of participation from other rowing nations in the way the authorities expected. But as I say, 96 was also where women were admitted to the Olympic regatta for the first time, and also for the first time qualification rules were brought in, because there was an upper limit of 550 athletes at the Olympic regatta. When you, if you're hosting an Olympics, you build your Olympic village to host 10,500 athletes, and those athletes are chopped up according to the number in each Olympic discipline, and 550 has been the rowing allocation for many years now. And each sport has to fight tooth and nail to maintain its allocation as each successive Olympics tries to bring in more and more different sports to add to the Olympic program. But from a GB point of view, a momentary lapse, because these guys were the only gold medal won by GB in the entire games. So when Pinsent and Redgrave got out of the boat after yet another gold medal in the 2 minors, this was the famous occasion when Redgrave said, "If anybody finds me anywhere near a boat, then do please shoot me." And we all know what happened after that. Just a word about these qualification rules. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the current quota for rowing at the Tokyo Games has been reduced. It's a total of 526. And we will now have gender equity, hoping, fingers crossed, that the games go ahead this summer. We'll have gender equity because there will be 7 events for men and 7 events for women. This is really good news. This is the direction of travel. And the vast majority of those places have already been determined according to the performance in the World Championships in Austria 2 years ago. So that's the left-hand column here. So you can see that according to the different events, the top 5 eights, the top 9 single sculls, etc., earned for their country a place in the Olympic regatta. And then throughout this season, there will be continental qualification events to determine the additional single sculls and lightweight double sculls. And then there'll be a final Olympic qualification regatta to be held in Lucerne in June, where the final places would be decided to decide the absolute makeup, and 263 athletes for men and the same number for women. That's the way in which it's made up. And the good news for Great Britain, they tied at the top of the qualification number of crews, along with the Netherlands, 10 crews each after those championships in Linz. So despite the fact that Great Britain didn't feature strongly on the medal table, they did feature strongly in terms of the number of crews that we qualified for Tokyo. 2000, Sydney, and here I'm showing you this aerial view because I've talked a lot about the standardization of 6 lanes, 2,000 meters, but in the same way, the architecture, the layout of an Olympic regatta had gradually become standardized. There's a lady called Svetla Otsetova, who's a Bulgarian Olympic gold medalist from 1976, who's been the technical director for World Rowing for many years. And she's a professional architect, and she designs many of these courses. And this is the standard model now, where you get the racing lanes up there on the right-hand side of your picture, but the boating, the embarkation and disembarkation pontoons are on this island in the center shot, and the warm-up water is at the top of your picture on the right, and the cool-down water off to the left, so that you can say a one-way system is all the way around that narrow island, and way off picture in the top right. After that warm-up, the crews are brought onto the racing lanes, called up onto the pontoons. They'll race, they'll come down across the finish line next to the tower there. They'll then paddle under the bridge, bottom left, go and cool down, and then come into the disembarkation platform. So I've got to mention the women's quad at Sydney. Great Britain were back in with a vengeance. First gold medal in men's 8 since Stockholm 1912, but the first Olympic medal for GB women, silver for the GB women's quad with the Batten sisters and Catherine Granger and Gillian Lindsay. It really was a landmark for GB women. 4 years later, and we're back in Athens, and you can see the model that I'm talking about in terms of the regatta layout. And from a Cornish perspective, well, I've got to mention the men's 4, haven't I? Because there's Ed Code, second from left, along with Matthew Pinsent, James Cracknell, and Steve Williams. And their gold medal in the men's 4 was notable not only for the fact that it included a Cornish-born rower, but also because it was proof positive that GB could succeed at the topmost level, despite the fact that Redgrave had now retired from international competition. And it was another gold medal for Jürgen Grobler, who was now many years into his post as chief of GB men's rowing. 4 years later, and we are now at the Chunyi Olympic Park outside Beijing. Again, it's just outside the ring motorway for Beijing, so to give you a sense of how far away from the center of the action it was. Now, this was my favorite event of the regatta. I was right alongside the men's 4 throughout the race, and this for me was one of my favorite events ever, because the GB men's 4, who were hot favorites to retain the Olympic title, and yet they were down on the Australians throughout the majority of this course, until with 2:50 to go, Andy Triggs-Hodge in the stroke seat there jacked the rate up to 45. Now, can you remember the last time you rated 45 doing anything? What tends to happen when you increase the rate like that is that the work falls off. But here in an Olympic final, the work went on, and I was talking with Steve Williams afterwards in the interview stand, and he said, you know, we discovered things about ourselves during that final 250 we did not know existed. They found energy reserves that they were unaware of until the chips were down and they knew they had to do something special, and they overhauled the Australians for another gold medal. And of course, from a Cornish perspective, one of the major disappointments came in the women's quad. So there's Annie Vernon, Debbie Flood, Fran Horton and Catherine Granger, who'd won successive world titles in the women's quads. And then they were overhauled in the closing stages by the Chinese. And you can see the disappointment written on their faces. I mean, an Olympic silver medal is a fantastic result in most people's books. But for this particular crew, it what really was a slap in the face. I'm showing you this picture because to Western eyes, the idea that China could be successful at rowing appears to not ring true, because the Western perception of Chinese people is that they tend to be shorter and not particularly suited to open weight rowing as we understand it. Now, this is the 2007 World Junior Championships. The juniors, the year before the Olympics, is used as a dress rehearsal for the Olympic regatta. And here is China getting the bronze medal in men's eights at those World Juniors in 2007. And there's the three-man just getting his medal. And he is 2 meters tall, and he weighs 100 kilos, and he's 14 years old. So when you've got a country of 1.5 billion people, then you can pick and choose who you select to form your Olympic rowing squad. And there are some amazingly tall people out there. And they're the guys who are targeted in the same way that the Eastern Bloc used to do in DDR and Soviet Union days to populate their successful Olympic and international crews. Right, well, here's one we all remember, Eton Dorney 2012. I dare say that some of you were in the grandstands on that occasion, and you will remember the Dorney Roar. It was a fantastic atmosphere, having 35,000 people around the finish line of an Olympics. It really created an atmosphere which was totally unlike any other international event where I've worked. I think as a commentator, I could have said anything I liked during the last 250 meters. I was completely drowned out by the crowd. But anyway, that's as may be. Now, who am I going to concentrate on? Because there was so much GB success. Well, let's start off with Helen Glover from Penzance, along with Heather Stanning. I said in the commentary, Helen came from Penzance. Heather's hometown is Lossiemouth up there in Scotland. And again, we've talked a lot, haven't we, about how different people from different backgrounds. So Helen, a PE teacher, Heather, an army officer, but they came together in a boat, as we know, and they went amazingly fast. And this was a goal that they were going to repeat in Rio in another 4 years' time. I've got to mention the para rowing. Para Olympic rowing had been introduced in the Beijing Games 4 years previously, and GB has proved itself immensely successful at the para rowing classes. And here's our para 4 winning gold at 2012. And they did it again at Rio 4 years later. And we're also looking very strong indeed. As things stand at the moment, it's the para 4s in which is the only Olympic rowing discipline, either para or able-bodied, in which GB is the current world champion. So that's a strong pedigree to go into Tokyo. Right, we're bringing right up to speed because we're only 5 years ago now, and we are in Rio at the complicated name Lagoa de Rodrigo Freitas. For Olympic terms, this was shortened down to the Lagoa Stadium because they felt that nobody really knew nor cared who Rodrigo Freitas was. He was a 17th century Portuguese army officer who married into the family that actually owned the lake at the time. I knew you wanted to know that. But this was an amazingly scenic course, and it is right downtown. Some of you may have been to Brazil, you might have been to Rio. If I tell you that the Copacabana beach is just about a quarter of a mile away from the venue, off to the right, Downtown Rio is just the other side of that right-hand Olympic ring through that little pass there. And then up on the mountain, the Corcovado Mountain, is the statue of Christ the Redeemer looking down on the Olympic rowing venue. When the crews went afloat for the first time on this lake, they just paddled around and their coaches allowed them to just lap up the atmosphere. They were allowed to look up at the statue. They were allowed to just paddle around the lake and try and absorb the fact that people living in the enormous blocks of flats surrounding the venue were going to get a grandstand view of the racing. Because this was totally unlike anything that any of them had previously experienced. So then, having absorbed that atmosphere, then on subsequent outings, they could get down to actually doing some proper work. And of course, again, one of the big successes was this silver medal for the GB Women's 8. And there's Fran Horton, third from the left, who retired from Olympic rowing after this. This was her 5th Olympics. She went along to Sydney as the traveling spare. And I talked about her silver medal in Beijing. But again, a phenomenal Olympic career. And some of you will have read the book that she published last year. And I'm not on a commission basis, so I'm not here to sell her book, but I know that she'll be glad of continued subscriptions. Right, let's bring us up to the here and now. And here we are at the games that weren't last year. The 2020 games were due to be held not on the Toda Regatta course that was hosted the games in 1964, but on this purpose-built course that is the Sea Forest Waterway. So let's just give you an idea where that is. So there's downtown Tokyo at the top of the picture, and the Toda course is off on a little river up the top there. And the Sea Forest Waterway bisects that island you can see in the middle of the harbour, bottom right. And this is a purpose-built island, and believe it or not, this is the Tokyo City rubbish tip. They have been dumping their rubbish here in the middle of the harbour for years to create this island, and then they've sliced it up in this way that you can see, and they've landscaped it. So don't worry, if you go there and you stick your toe in the earth, you're not going to come up against something nasty, because they've done a really good job of it. Just to give you a reflection, off to the left there, that bit of green, that is the equestrian cross-country course. So that they've built in a whole load of infrastructure, but it's also a working docks. So at the top of your picture there, that's a big container port. So as you're sitting there on the Olympic regatta course that will also host the flat water canoeing events, you can see all these big container cranes on the skyline all around you. And for the first time since Helsinki, the event is being hosted back on seawater. And to offset the idea that there'll be unfair conditions, there are pontoons and battens that closing off either end of the course and also longitudinally running down either side of the course to prevent any chance of waves setting up and making it a bit laney. Here's the World Juniors being staged in 2019 on the course. This is the GB Junior Quad. And there in the background is the thing that looks a bit like a dinosaur. This is the Tokyo Harbour Bridge that has become one of the iconic backdrops of the Olympic course. Fast forward another 3 years and we are in Paris, and here is the purpose-built course. We will not be on the River Seine because we need to have still water. We need 6,000, we need 6 lanes, we need 2,000 meters. And so the Ile-de-France purpose-built stadium will host the events on that occasion, and fingers crossed it will go ahead. But I was talking about lightweights, and lightweight double sculls will still be part of the program. So the lightweights are hanging on in there. because of the short time frame before the next games, the IOC has decreed that there will not be any change in the program. Some of you may have heard the rumors about the way in which the about coastal events will be absorbed into the Olympic rowing program. And yes, that's on the cards for Los Angeles 2028, but the Olympic program will stay the same for Paris. So that brings me to the end, ladies and gentlemen. You've been amazingly quiet on the chat. I'm going to stop the screen share there, and by all means, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves, and if you want to type in any questions or ask any questions, then now's your chance.
Hello.
Hello, Joe.
Any questions? Oh, here we are.
Have I dumbfounded everybody? Have they all gone off to supper, I think?
I think George has asked a question on the chat.
Not on the... Oh, do I have a favourite games? Thanks, George. You know, I think it's a question I was asked previously, because I gave a similar talk to another audience a few weeks ago. And they said, do I have a favourite games where I've worked, or do I have a favourite games where I'd like to have been? And my favourite games has been 2012. Because I've been to Dorney so many times on and off the water, and I arrived at Dorney for the 2012 games because it had been locked down while the Olympic prep had been done, and I didn't recognise the place. And I said, you know, who's taken away the Dorney that I know and installed this absolutely fantastic Olympic course? Because the dressing up that had been done, the way in which it had been done, was absolutely fantastic. And then when the crowd started piling in, and there were grandstands on both sides of the finish, and that's unusual for an Olympic course, to have big crowds on both sides. Normally they're only on one side, but usually typically because they run out of money, they don't have it on both sides. And the games I'd like to have been at was 1908 games. I'd like to have been at Henley for the 08 games, because yeah, it would have been quite special, I think.
What was your most exciting race to commentate on?
Well, I've talked about the men's fours in Beijing. The men's pairs at 2012, when Will Satch and George Nash got the bronze medal, that was completely unexpected because they were the spare pair. The 8 had been sorted and they won bronze. The 4 had been sorted and they won gold. And then the spare pair go and win a medal. Completely unexpected. Oh, crikey, another question's coming. If I had to choose a top 3 iconic places to row, I'm going to broaden that question out, Sue. My favourite rowing venues are always the natural rowing courses. As we all know, the international rowing courses these days are purpose-built ditches in the middle of nowhere. You know, Dorney, Chuney, Oberschleißheim. They've got no character, but where you can create an international rowing course out of an existing natural lake, like they've done in Lucerne, Carapiro in New Zealand, the Martindale Pond in Canada, Lake Aiguebelette in France, these, Lake Bled, of course, in Slovenia. They've got character about them, and they've got something special. They allow the the crowd to get up close to the rowing and to create a special backdrop so that it doesn't just look like the blasted heath.
Have you ever been at a loss for words while commentating?
Yes, but I don't let it show. And as you know, I train new commentators. And the trick is never to be at a loss for words. So I prepare lots of things to say. And if you run out of things to say, then that's the fast road to nowhere. There was a boat race many years ago before television days. And the BBC radio commentator at the time ran out of things to say because the start of the race was delayed. So the way he got round it, because there was nothing to talk about, there were boats milling about, the crews had gone off the water to sort themselves out, and he had so much time to fill. So the way in which he filled on that occasion was by reading out the advertising hoardings that were along the embankment and across Putney Bridge. And this was on the BBC, where advertising was not allowed. And there he was reading out commercial statements. And he was pulled off the mic, and he hasn't been seen nor heard of since.
So not one to repeat then.
Yeah, but no, the idea of being a commentator is to try and make the audience believe that they're at the venue. So even though it depends whether I'm commentating for video or for audio. So it's a fairly mixed audience. So some of them can see what's happening and some of them can't. So it's important for those that can't see what's happening to get a rough idea of the surroundings. And it's important for those, whether or not they can see what's happening or not, to try and read the race and to see who's making a push and who's likely to make a push. So as an example of that, the World Championships in 1986, which were held in Nottingham. And again, I had the luxury of being in a car alongside the course. So I could pick and choose which part of the race I wanted to talk about, whereas typically the TV director will always pick the action going on at the front of the field. And that may not be where the race is to be had. And I could see Australia at the back end of the field. So at the halfway mark, Australia was sixth. And they were just steadily eating their way back through the field. And I could see that, but the TV director couldn't. And he didn't have a spotter to tell him that that's what was happening. So and they won the gold medal. So I'm using that as an example of when I'm alongside the race, which I am more often than not, then I can pick and choose which segment of the race I want to talk about. And typically it's the middle of the race, because certainly in the early heats, I'm talking about where the qualifying slots are to be decided for the next round. And that's not just the leading crew, it could be the first two or the first three, etc., across the line. So I'll tell my driver I want to be where the cut is, and I'll tell him or her at the start of the race, there are X crews from this race to go through to the next round, so that's where I want to be. So I don't care who's winning, but as much as I care what's happening in the middle of the race where the qualifying slots is being sorted out.
Robert, what was the most unusual finish to a race you've ever seen?
The most unusual finish, I don't know. One of the most unusual occurrences in a race was the lightweight men's doubles in 2012, when Zach Purchase came off his seat in the first 100 meters. And there is continuing controversy about exactly what happened on that occasion, because of course, Purchase and Hunter were the home favorites to repeat their gold they'd won in Beijing. and yet it was the Danes who led them through the first 100 meters. And then ostensibly, Zach's slide stuck, jammed, and because it was in the first 100 meters, then he could claim an equipment failure, and he held up his seat to indicate to the umpire there was a problem, and all the crews were recalled, and the jury was still out on whether his slide had actually jammed or whether he had created a political foul because he realized that they were being led through the first stages. And in fact, anyway, it worked out that Denmark went ahead and won the gold anyway after the restart, and Purchase and Hunter won the silver. So the result was allowed to stand. I mean, I suppose the other unusual result was at the same regatta. Now, here's an issue. I've talked about laney regattas, and this is one of the challenges for the so-called Fairness Commission. World Rowing has a fairness committee composed of very experienced men and women at every international event, and they decide how fair the course is and whether there will be a straight lane draw, with the fastest qualifiers from the previous rounds drawing the center lanes 3 and 4, which is generally what happens, and the slowest qualifiers in the outside lanes. And if they feel that the course is laney in any way, then they can say, right, we're not going to race over lanes 1 to 6, we'll race it over lanes 2 to 7 or 0 to 5, because there are 8 lanes across an international standard course. Or they might have a complete lane redraw and say the fastest qualifier will be in lane 1 and the slowest qualifier in lane 6. And one of the big dilemmas that they often face is that the weather, the wind conditions will be different at different parts of the course. And the other issue is that by the time the weather has changed, the wind has changed, and that they feel that they want to call a redraw, the crews have already warmed up and they're ready to come on to the start for the next race. And they can't easily call a redraw right then and there without causing organizational havoc. And I think that's one of the many factors that was brought into play with the just before the final of the lightweight men's fours in 2012, when South Africa won the gold ahead of Great Britain, and GB felt they'd been robbed. I mean, South Africa, immensely strong crew. It was their first and only gold in the lightweight men's four, and all credit to South Africa. But you know, I use that race as an illustration of the dilemmas, and in the same way that, you know, in a football match you blame the ref for what you feel is an unfair situation. That's the rowing equivalent, to blame the Fairness Commission for a result that doesn't work out as you'd expected. Well, let's call a halt there. Thank you so much, everybody. I am recording this, and I will I'll edit the final footage, and then I'll probably put the final edited version up on YouTube and then send you all the link. So thanks very much for your attention and your questions, and I'll hope to see you again before long.